Hi, Dr. Bianchi, critical art historian. We're looking at a stela, S-T-E-L-A, from the classical word that means a monument. It could be in stone, as you see here, or in wood. Stela generally are taller than they are wide, and in ancient Egypt, stela are used for two primary purposes. On the one hand, an Egyptian stela could be commemorative in order to celebrate deeds of Pharaoh, which Pharaoh wanted posterity to remember. And on the other hand, the second function is as a funerary stela, as you see here, used to commemorate the deceased. And like funerary stela that we might find in cemeteries today in the West, this particular example likewise has a round top. Now we need to explain that ancient Egyptian sculptors were not possessed of independent license. In other words, an individual in ancient Egypt could not just go to a mountain, quarry a piece of stone, go back to a studio, and create something. Expeditions to collect stone that were being used for stela, such as this, were religiously sanctioned royal commissions. And the expedition had to go to the quarry, get the stone had to be brought back to the workshop. It was dressed into its final shape and then handed over to an artist to complete. Now, this complete example, and we'll turn you around coming this way, you can see that it's rough. It's rough. You can see the chisel marks. And go around to the back, and you can see again quite clearly how rough it is over there. So this particular stela was quarried, and only the front surface was dressed. We know from experimental archaeology that the entire process probably took between 1 and 2 months. Now that does not mean it took 30 to 60 days just to decorate the front. That 30 to 60 day period includes the sending of the expedition to the quarry, the quarrying of the stone, the transport of the stone back to the workshop, the dressing of the stone, the final polishing of the front surface, and the artisan who was responsible for adding the decoration. So it was a very, very labor-intensive endeavor. Now, the interesting thing about ancient Egyptian funerary stela is the fact that various localities in ancient Egypt created a template, and that template was used repeatedly to manufacture stela that are localized. Think of automobile manufacturers that have certain designs on their automobiles. So when you see an automobile with this particular design, you can say, it's by that manufacturer. So many instances in ancient Egypt, when we see a design, we can say, I have a pretty good idea of where this stela actually was erected. Now, in this particular example, we see a ground line, and then we see a figure of the deceased as a mummy, and the deceased is standing in front of an offering table, and the offering table has 3 round circles. They represent loaves of bread. Think of a Tuscan loaf. And on top, we have a bird, and then we have an inscription in 2 lines, and then we have a winged sun disk in what is known as the lunette. Now, we want to talk a little bit about the stela. It looks like it was something that was created, what we call off the rack, because if you notice, the carving of the main figure, the offering table, and the stela, the winged sun disk at the top, is a little bit more sure and a little bit more confident than some schematic carving of the duck, which you see here. So if you were to compare then the way the inscription at the top of the stela is carved and the duck, you would find out that they were made at two different periods. So we are assuming that the heirs, relatives, friends of the deceased went to an atelier, a studio, saw a tombstone, a stela that they wanted, and then tweaked it. And that tweak added the duck that you see over here, so that maybe in the hereafter, the deceased would have more than just bread to eat. Maybe he luck baking duck or duck à l'orange. And then to personalize the monument, the individuals ask that the name and parent of the deceased represented by the mummy should be added at the top. Now, the top inscription that has the name of the deceased and his parent is written in demotic, and we'll explain that right now. There are three notational systems for ancient Egypt. The one that's most familiar to all of us is hieroglyphs, which is writing with pictures. And we can compare hieroglyphs to printing, like you'll see in a newspaper. The second notational system is hieratic. And if we continue the analogy, hieratic is longhand or script. And within that analogy, demotic would represent a kind of shorthand. And demotic is very, very difficult to read, and there's only a few specialists worldwide who are competent in reading demotic. And colleagues have assisted me in reading the name up here. And the two lines begin, Wezer Horem Heb. The Egyptians, when they died, wanted to be associated with the god Osiris. So it is very, very common in epithets to have the name of the deceased preceded by the epithet Wezer. So we are reading the Osiris Horem Heb. And then we have Embes Taha Sheri Jehudi, born of Tasheri Jehudi, the child of Thoth. And that's the name of his mother. So when you put them all together, we can give you a figurative translation that this stela was made for the deceased, identified with Osiris, whose name was Horem Heb, and his mother, the woman who gave birth to him, was Tasheri Jehudi, the child of the god Thoth, the god of wisdom. And when you look at the stela, you need to look beyond the fact that there's a mummy, an offering table, a fowl, and an inscription, and the winged sun disk, and understand that the material and the color of an object further the purpose and function to which it served. Now, in ancient Egypt, the most durable, permanent, everlasting material in their environment was stone. Anything written on stone, anything placed into a container of stone, was imagined to be able to last forever and ever and ever. So if you have a tombstone and you want it to last forever, the suitable material is stone, in this case limestone. But the color of the limestone adds to the meaning of the object. Because in ancient Egypt, the color white symbolized purity. And if the deceased was going to live forever in a divine state, he didn't want his body or his mummy to become decayed or corroded. He wanted to live in a pure state. So the ancient Egyptians purposefully carved the effigy of the deceased as a mummy, They put his name and his mother's name on the stela. They provided him with food, bread and fowl, so that in the afterlife, Horemheb would live in a pure state forever and ever and ever. And one last point to understand. The Egyptians tried to design environments. So when you look at an example such as this line is not fortuitous, it's not there by accident. And the vault that you see up here is not by accident either. Because you then have to understand the composition is designed as the deceased standing on a ground line underneath the vault of heaven. So what we have is a representation of the environment in which the deceased wishes to live forever and ever and ever. And one last point I think deserves mention, and that is many of us like the simplicity of a drawing by someone like Ang or Picasso, where in a very, very quick way, they sketch the design as if it's just absolutely rapid. And when you look at this stele of Horemheb, there are no grids. There's no pre-planning. So here we have an example, a wonderful example, of a craftsman who got the finished block of stone from the quarry, smoothed the front surface, and then without any pre-planning or drawing, took his chisel and boom, 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 created this wonderful, simple design, linear design. And then that linear design was tweaked by the people who acquired the stela on behalf of the deceased by the addition of the bird and the addition of the inscription. So remember, when you go to a museum, you visit Egypt, and you look at a monument, do not be seduced by saying, oh, it's a mummy and offering it, and walk away. Oh, on the contrary. In order to understand and get a deeper appreciation, understand the composition, take into account the material, and remember the color of that material, because these are added dimensions that will enable you to get a more complete understanding of the complexity of the Egyptian designs that you're looking at. Dr. Bob.